Welcome back to the We Who Thirst Patreon podcast. Today we are talking about patricentric heterarchy. Before we get into that, I want to go back and talk about, quotes, biblical patriarchy in the modern setting. I will be using some visuals, which if you are listening to the audio, you can either get the visual pack to look over at your convenience, or you can watch the video if you want to see me talk through the visuals, but I will verbally describe them as we go through. So to start, let's look at some modern patriarchalists and what they say as our foundation for understanding both the modern context of patriarchy, and that will enable us to understand the ancient world, which was a patricentric heterarchy, and the differences between modern, quotes, biblical patriarchy and the ancient Near East's patricentric heterarchy. Gothard, Piper, and DeYoung are three biblical patriarchal teachers that I want to highlight. Gothard, many of us are familiar with because of his umbrella diagram, which has an umbrella, three sets of umbrellas. You have God, the Father, the Mother, and the children. Each one of these umbrellas represents authority that is supposed to be protective. And if you walk out from under this protective umbrella of authority, it puts you in danger. So God is obviously the topmost authority with the Father underneath, and the Father is over both the mother and the children. So the mother and children have to be careful not to step out from under the Father's authority. Another way Gothard describes this is the responsibility pyramid, with the husband at the top and the wife inside and underneath the husband. Gothard says that the husband is to be the priest leader of the family. He is to be the protector and the provider. I find the provider part to be most interesting because as I talk to any complementarian about the roles of men and women, provider comes up continually, that the man is to be the breadwinner, the provider for the family. And as we get into patricentric heterarchy, we will test that theory to see if it is a modern cultural concept or one that is normative across all time periods. And so Gothard holds these three responsibilities for the husband: priest, leader, protection, and provider. Another very popular biblical patriarchalist would be John Piper. He upholds strong distinctions between men and women, and he says, and I quote, "Underneath these distinctions and roles are profound differences in the very nature of manhood and womanhood," end quote. Piper says that biblical manhood is a responsibility for women to lead, protect, and provide for women. So you see those same themes again: leadership, protection, and provision. Womanhood, Piper says, must be receptive and affirming and nurturing of men's strength and leadership. Piper would say this is especially true in marriage, but it is generally true for all manhood and womanhood if they are to work in biblical ways. The responsibility and the reception of leadership for men and women will look different depending on the relationships, but it still is there. Piper teaches very clearly that a woman's interactions with men must be personal and non-directive. So you have a personal relationship with a man, and if you have a personal relationship, spouse, friend, father, brother, etc., it can be a non-directive relationship. You can't tell that man what to do if you have a personal relationship. He says, or a woman's relationship could be directive but non-personal. So a woman could be an author or a city planner or someone who designs where a road would go. That inadvertently directs a man because he has to drive on the road she designed, but it's not personal. He has no relationship with this woman and probably doesn't even know the woman made the road or designed the road or was the architect for the building he lives in. So it's non-personal. But Piper says if a woman is personal relationship and directive, she tells him what to do, she will, quote, offend a man's good God-given sense of responsibility and leadership, and thus controvert God's created order. So according to Piper, if a woman tells a man what to do and she's in a relationship with that man, i.e. face-to-face, they can actually see each other, then she is undermining God's created order. Piper says that there's a huge danger when the roles are reversed and the woman leads. And that if a woman is giving directives to a man, neither party will flourish. So he very much believes in this top-down hierarchy where men are to lead and women aren't even to tell them what to do if they have face-to-face contact. And Piper would even take this down to driving directions. If a man is lost and he needs driving directions and he asks a woman, she has to figure out how to help him get that information without simply saying, take Smith Street and then turn right on Maple and turn left on Ezekiel Avenue and you will be at the gas station. Because that would be too directive. And so if she wants to honor God, she has to figure out a backwards way of getting him that information, maybe hand him a map or something. Piper doesn't tell us how this works, but that she would need to figure out a way to get the man the information without controverting God's creative order by giving him clear directions on how to drive. That's John Piper's version of quotes biblical, quote, end quote, patriarchy. Lastly, I want to talk about Kevin DeYoung. He wrote an article in 2022. You can find that in the show notes or in the bibliography on the PDF that goes with this show. Kevin DeYoung says, quote, we need to help people see that our exegetical conclusions are the way we do Bible study, do not just fit with the best hermeneutical principles, they fit with the way the world is and the way God made men and women. So Kevin DeYoung is very concerned with scripture, how we understand scripture, which is hermeneutics, and number three, the way the world works. A lot of these men really, really stand on the point, this is the way the world works. It's always been this way, therefore it's God's created ideal for men and women. We can argue that point at another time. Today, we're going to stay on track. DeYoung says, patriarchy rightly conceived, and this is really important, so I'm going to slow down. DeYoung says, patriarchy, rightly conceived, is not about the subjugation of women as much as it is about the subjugation of the male aggression and male irresponsibility that runs wild when women are forced to be in charge because men are nowhere to be found. This quote is subtle, but it's also extremely dangerous, because he's basically saying that men have to be in charge. And if they are not in charge, then they will be irresponsible. So because a man is naturally bent to be irresponsible, he has to rule over women and children. That's the flavor of patriarchy we're getting here. DeYoung goes on to say that, quote, the choice is not between patriarchy and enlightened democracy, but between patriarchy and anarchy. Patriarchy reflects the innate differences between the sexes, and we would do well to embrace what is. So DeYoung sees patriarchy as necessary, and if you don't have patriarchy, it's pretty much who knows what, anarchy, no structure, no order at all. So as we look at these modern day patriarchalists, many of us were raised, I'm sure you have some internal reactions as you were seeing or hearing the words I am reading. I want us to keep this in mind because their main points are that patriarchy is necessary, it is the way it's always been, and men are responsible for the leadership, protection, and provision. Those three words I want you to keep in mind as we go through this entire podcast today. So the next thing we're going to do is look at patriarchy. Now, patriarchy literally means rule of father. It implies a top-down authority structure, a hierarchy typically based on gender and age, where you have a man or husband at the top, you have a woman under him, and then any children under that. It's basically Gothard's umbrella diagram in a different way. Myers gives a definition of hierarchy as, quote, an organizational structure in which some elements are subordinate to others and are usually ranked accordingly, end quote. So Myers just defines hierarchy about one person being under another in an organizational structure. She leaves gender outside of that hierarchy. Patriarchy, though, means rule of father. So it is a gender-based hierarchy with men at the top. Hierarchy assumes the person on the top has authority and potential rule over their subordinates. The term patriarchy, the idea that the ancient world was organized as a patriarchy, was started in the mid-1800s in Europe and America with classicist professors. These are professors who studied Greco-Roman literature, the classics from the 200-300s BCE, and reading these Greek philosophers came up with the idea of patriarchy. They said, as we read the Greek philosophers, they seem to be patriarchal, so therefore we're going to coin the term patriarchy, literally translated rule of father. The term was first used by a German historian theologian who wrote about the culture of the Bible in 1887 through 1888. And because of these theologians who did not have a lot of archaeological or ethnographic studies available to them, they didn't have the evidence we have now. They were doing the best they could to understand the ancient cultures through what they had, which was primarily the classic works of philosophy. They came up with the idea of patriarchy. And now anybody I ask and I say, have you heard that the culture of the Bible is a patriarchy? They all say, yes. Yes, they have heard that the culture of the Bible was a patriarchy. And so that is how it is viewed in the Bible. And that means that for the modern day, many hierarchical complementarians, and definitely patriarchalists believe that we should organize our families in a top-down structure with the man over the woman and the woman focused back on the man. So from the man, he has to, and again, this is the same themes as we talked about with Gothard, Piper, and DeYoung. From the man, he has to exercise leadership. He has to lead or he'll fall into irresponsibility. He needs to protect the family, provide for the family. And the subtlety in there is that he has the right to be offended if she leads or is directive. The woman's responsibility is to focus on affirming and following the man's leadership, and she is never to be directive, i.e. commanding or forceful in her communication. So strong emotion, clear, cut to the chase communication. I need the marshmallows to go on the second shelf of the pantry is out. We don't talk like that as women, according to these sorts of authors. They do give some important caveats on how men should lead. They say men must lead gently and humbly, serving and sacrificing for the women in their life for their good. He needs to be mobilizing the woman's strengths. He should be initiating action and should have the final say in conversations and disagreement. The woman may help him with the provision, and he needs to lead in the discipline of the children. And he needs to adapt to cultural expressions of masculinity, but not the sinful ones or aggressive, perverted ones. The woman needs to advocate for this style of complementarianism and patriarchy. She needs to be looking to and be glad to be led by the men in her life. And she needs to nurture his leadership. She is responsible not just to receive his leadership, but to nurture his masculinity, to be a partner and to be his assistant. So that is just a high-level overview of modern patriarchy and what we think of. I'm defining terms clearly. What do we think of when we hear the term patriarchy? What is it? What are we being taught that it is? Now, let's move to patricentrism. Let's understand what patricentrism is. Patricentric communities are organized socially and politically and geographically around the oldest male, and this provided stability for the family unit. In order to understand what patricentric heterarchy is, we need to understand parts, and this is not exhaustive, but part of the reason why patricentric heterarchy was important. There were reasons for this organizational style of families and community, and a lot of these reasons we don't have today. So our family community structures look far different because of some key elements. There are some things that the ancient world did not have most of the time that we do, and we take for granted in these conversations. So I want to bring them to light so that we are thinking contextually and accurately. The ancient world, especially Iron Age Israel, did not have a strong centralized government. Strong centralized governments, for all their flaws, and I'm not getting into the flaws of modern governance, but a strong centralized government is supposed to provide military protection for its members. It's supposed to provide firm geographical borders. So we know exactly where the borders of the United States of America is. We know exactly where the borders of Texas is, and Alabama and New York State and California. We have very clear borders, and we have a military assigned protection of those borders. And bad guys, enemies, however you want to phrase it, are not supposed to come through those borders to attack us. And the government is a barrier between us and people who would attack us. And we take this for granted. We also have emergency services, police, fire, medical. Whether or not they are working the way they are supposed to, they are structured into our society so that when we have a problem, someone robs us, there's a fire in our house, somebody's having a heart attack, we have somebody to call and they're supposed to come help immediately. We have hospitals, emergency rooms. We're supposed to have an impartial judiciary system. It is broken in America, it's not working, but we at least have the concept, the idea of a separate judiciary system from our family. My family does not have a judiciary function in the community at all, ever. There is a court in the city I live in. And if there is an issue, you go through the judiciary system to the court, and the problem is supposed to be taken care of there, but it is separated from the family unit. In the ancient world, their primary concerns are safety, provision / production, and labor, which is needed for both the safety and the provision production. And so those needs will undergird their societal structures. And those needs, for many of those needs undergird all societies, and most of our safety needs are taken care of by our strong centralized government today. But the ancient world didn't have that. Sometimes in your big empires like Egypt and Rome and Babylon, you had some of that strong centralized government protection, though sometimes the government was the one hurting you in those cases, so you still weren't safe. But in Iron Age Israel, which is where we see a lot of the Bible happen, they needed safety, they needed protection, provision, and they needed labor for these things to happen. You can't have safety if you don't have men to protect you, if you don't have men to pick up swords and to fight, and you don't have provision if you don't have people to farm the land and get everything that you need. Their social structure, we today have a social structure of individual family units, husband, wife, children, nuclear families most of the time, and they are in separate domicile houses, and all of these houses are near each other in a city, which is then in a state, which is in a country, which has strong, secure geographical borders. In ancient Israel, they had a tribe, and then a subunit of the tribe was the clan, and then the subunit of the clan was the household, which was a nuclear family, but it was larger than a nuclear family, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So their social structure is different, and these social structures do not have strong geographical borders. They do not have a standing army or a military presence. Somebody comes in to attack the tribe, clan, or household, it is the people of the tribe, clan, and household who have to put down their plow, pick up their sword, and go fight. If they even have a sword, maybe it's just a sharpened stick. And that is, so their level of safety is very different. The land that they need for provision, production, and survival comes through, for Israel, the tribe, clan, down to the household. So each tribe of Israel was given a section of land, and then they dispersed that land to the clans that make up the tribe, and then the clan would disperse the land to the individual household, and then the household has this land. The land is needed for survival. If you can't farm your land, you can't grow food, and if you can't grow food, you starve to death. They are battling against literal starvation. We take food and the plentifulness of food for granted. I should have added that to this, the things they did not have. They did not have plentiful food. They could not take that for granted. So they needed the land for survival. Wage earning at many points in Israel's history is not possible, especially when they are sustenance agrarian farmers. You can't go and just get a job to earn money to buy food. You have to grow and make your own food. So the land is extremely important for the very survival of the people. And so protecting your family's land is really high up on your priority list. Today, my family, my husband and I, we own a house, we have land, but our house and our land is not necessary for our survival. If something happened and we lost this house and land, we would have other options. They didn't have those same options. The focus of the ancient person was survival. It was not human rights. It was not individual rights. No one in the ancient world is choosing their careers or making independent decisions. Those are values of modern culture. In the ancient world, they are focused on survival, provision, protection, safety, and the next generation to continue that cycle. Even the men, the patriarch, who we'll talk about in a minute, even he did not have rights to make his own independent decisions from the group. They are a communal culture. They are not an individualist culture, which is a whole other podcast. But they are communal and they are thinking in community. So let's get into the ancient household. The ancient household is a mixed group of people. You would have it was generally organized, an organizational structure around the oldest male. So if you're looking at the pictures, you have like a wagon wheel, and the oldest male is in the center of the wagon wheel, and each of the spokes go out to a different member of the household. So you have the oldest male, and you have his wife, you would have unmarried sons, you have adult sons and their families that would still be considered part of the household, unmarried daughters, you would have some widowed or divorced sisters, potentially the oldest male's mother, depending on his and her age. You would have servants and sojourners who are under the protection of the household, and unmarried brothers. So this is a multi-generational household of a variety of different relationships. Every household's going to look a little bit different because mortality rates were so high, but it would take all sorts of family members under the protection of the oldest male, who is known as the patriarch. He would be the oldest male, and he carries, and this is important to note, he carries the legal and political responsibility for the family. It's a representational culture. So he is the face of the family, the front door of the house, so to say. If something is going to come into the house, it is his job to stand and protect the family. So that is why we see Abraham engaging visitors who are coming by. Like when the angels come on their way to Sodom and Gomorrah, it's Abraham, not Sarah, who goes to greet them. He's like the front door. He's protecting the family. That is the patriarch's job. These households are also patrilocal. So they live either together in one domicile, if there's few enough people to live in one domicile, or they will have like a little compound of adjoining houses and rooms that have been built onto each other. And you have the patriarch, his son's family, grandson's families, brothers' families, all kind of living in this compound together. Today, my family's spread out all over the United States. I have a brother in New York City. I have a sister in Massachusetts. I have another sister in upstate New York. My parents are in Michigan. We are all over the place. We live in Texas. And so, but back then you stayed close to the patriarch. So that would look like my family living with my husband's father. So you have a society where you have a multi-generational household, organized, an organizational structure around the oldest male who is the face of the family in a representational culture, and he carries legal and political responsibility for the family. Everybody's living there together. And so what that means is that the oldest male has legal and political face for the family. He is the one who is showing up for the family at judicial legal proceedings in the clan or the tribe. That means his sons and his brothers may not be, even other men may not have this role in the household. Another thing that's really important to note is that in the ancient world, the basic economic unit was the household. Today, we think of the house, the home, and the business as being separate entities. An adult goes to work and brings home money. In the ancient world, the household is the basic economic unit, and everybody is working together to earn income for the family. Now, a patricentric culture is also patrilineal. Patrilineal means that ancestry is traced through the males. This is how they chose to do it, and land ownership is tied to the males. So both land and ancestry is traced through the males. They do this because they need to keep it in the household, and because a man could have multiple wives. So matrilineal lines can get kind of messy when a man can have multiple wives, and you have to keep track of whose land is whose, because your very survival depends on the land. So ancestry is traced through the males and property is passed down also through the males. So you have a father, you have the patriarch, he passes land on to his son. The next son might have two sons, so the land would be split between them. One of those sons might just have one son who has another son. The other son might have three sons, and so his land is split even further. But all of the land is passed down through the males, with the property being parceled out according to birth order. The oldest son of the patriarch will inherit, he does not have a choice in this, he will inherit the responsibility for care for the aged parents, unmarried sisters, and the weak and vulnerable members of the family. He would often get, according to Old Testament law, a double portion. So what a double portion means is that, let's say you have four sons. That means when the father dies, he would split his property into 5 portions. So he has 4 sons. He's going to split it into 5 portions. The oldest son gets 2 of the 5 portions. The other sons each get 1, because the oldest son has responsibility to care for his parents, his unmarried sisters, sojourners, anybody else in the household who needs care. So the extra portion of property is not to make him rich. It's not because he's favorite or better or anything else. He needs that financial cushion to take care of everybody he's responsible to take care of. The other 3 sons don't have that responsibility unless he dies, and then they might rework the property. But the other 3 sons do not have that responsibility, so they just get a single portion because they are only responsible for their own nuclear family and building out their own households in the future. The oldest son is responsible for his parents and any extended family members that need care. So that is how the oldest son is given why he's given a greater share of property. It's not about favoritism or that he's better. It's financial backing so that he can take care of the family in the ways he needs to as the next patriarch. So that is a basic overview of patricentrism and what it looks like in the ancient world, particularly for Iron Age Israel, but this also comes somewhat through the New Testament times as well. And if you like these graphics that I used, excuse my dog in the background, if you like these graphics that I used, be sure to download the PDF file that came with this podcast. So next we're going to talk about heterarchy. Heterarchy is a society where there are multiple sources of power that did not necessarily line up in a single set of vertical hierarchical relationships. So remember that patriarchy is a vertical hierarchy that depends on gender. But a heterarchy is where you have multiple sources of power that don't always line up in vertical hierarchy. A heterarchy supports the types of power women had in the ancient world, and it allows us to consider, quote, the intersection of gender with other variables like age and class, end quote. That would be Myers talking. So we're talking about a patricentric heterarchy. Patricentric talks about the organizational structure of the family unit, that it's organized around the men, how property and lineage are traced. Heterarchy is how we trace power and responsibility in the family. We've talked about the biblical patriarchalists, the modern patriarchalists who say that a husband needs to protect, provide, and lead the family. As I've discussed, the patriarch was in charge of protection. That is the one, in the ancient world, the one male role that was consistent. The man needed to protect. Stereotypically, men are most often bigger and stronger than women, and so the protection fell to them. The gender role women had most typically in the ancient world was procreation, having babies, because they're the only ones who are physically able to get pregnant and bear a child. So if you look at the ancient Near East, if you look at ancient Israel, and you think about the gender roles they had, they did not have the 3 gender roles of Grudem, Piper, Kevin DeYoung et al. Complementarians, who say a man should be the leader, provider, protector. The ancient world had one main male-only gender role, which is protection. And it had one main female-only gender role, which was procreation. actually bearing and nursing the child, which is necessary because they didn't have bottles, they didn't have milk. They had a few bottles, but it was still really important. They didn't have formula. That's what I'm trying to say. And so you have the two gender roles. You have men protect, women procreate. Provision, as we're going to see as we go through heterarchy, is shared between the genders continually. And leadership is task dependent according to the tasks that various members of the household needed to have. So I want you to keep that in mind. The modern patriarchalists say men need to lead, provide, protect, and women are supposed to support their tasks. The ancient world, men protect, women have babies, both provide, both lead according to their roles in the household, which heterarchy informs us of how that worked. So you have a patricentric, which is an organizational structure centered on the oldest male, and he is the face of the family representationally to the outside community, the front door. Then you have how inside the family did power structures actually work. That is heterarchy. Unlike patriarchy, which says, well, the power structure and the organizational structure are the same. Patriarchy says the power structure is top down, the man is over the woman, over the children. And that is both the power structure and the organizational structure. In the ancient world, you have organizational structure. It's centered around the oldest male, who is the representation of the household to the outside world. And then you have heterarchy, which is how you organize power according to the tasks that are necessary. And that is not in neat hierarchical rows like patriarchy. Let's get into heterarchy. So to review what I've already said, heterarchy is a society where, quote, multiple sources of power that did not necessarily line up in a single set of vertical hierarchical relationships. And this allows us to consider, quote, the intersection of gender with other variables like age and class. So before we get into the nitty gritty of heterarchy, let's talk about social class in the ancient world. Today, in modern patriarchalist mindset, you pretty much have men and women. There are not any other factors. You're either a man or a woman, and where you are in the hierarchy and in the home and in the church completely depends on your gender. In the ancient world, that was not so. There were at least 5 different areas that you would think about together as to your social status and where you fit. The first one is age. Are you older or are you younger? The next one would be your wealth. Are you rich, middle class, or poor? A country like the United States tried really hard to get rid of some of these wealth-oriented class. So ours is not as strong, though we still have it some, but not as strong as it was in the ancient world. In the ancient world, the rich, the middle class, and the poor were worlds apart. And then you have another citizen, non-citizen. Are you a man or a woman? Gender is one of the 5 social class aspects. And then are you freeborn, freed, or slave? This was especially prevalent in the Roman world, but we see language like this also in the Mosaic Law. And so you have these 5 aspects that make up one's position in the social class of their day, their place in the society. And it is age, wealth, citizenship, gender, and freedom. And where you're at with those 5 depends whether you are higher class or lower class. Where one stood socially depends on each of the metrics and one's connection with people of power. And one's families earned honor. This is an honor-shame society. Your family needs to earn honor, and that is another aspect I didn't list in the 5 of social class. In the Greco-Roman world, also I would say the Old Testament Hebraic world, but especially in the Greco-Roman world, if all other status markers were equal, men outranked women. So if you have a man and a woman who are the same age, they are the same wealth, they are both citizens, and they are both freeborn, the man would outrank the woman if everything else is the same. But there were many, many situations where women would outrank men. For example, an old, wealthy woman who is a citizen would outrank most every other man in her city. For example, a young, middle-class, non-citizen man, or even a young, rich man, if age trumps a lot of the other aspects. And so in the ancient world, they saw social class and where you stand in a social hierarchy dependent on a lot more than gender. But for modern, quote, biblical patriarchalists, gender is the only factor. They don't see anything else. They only see he's a man, you're a woman, therefore he leads, women follow. But in the ancient world, it was much more nuanced by that. Social status was a complex mix of family of origin, age, wealth, citizenship, gender, and standing. Gender was by no means the most important aspect of this. And functioning socially required an awareness of where you stood in each of those rankings and how those attributes were valued in your specific community. And it was also, what task are you trying to do, and which of these rankings is most important for what you're needing to accomplish in the moment. So as we understand heterarchy, we have to understand social class, and it is not just gender oriented. Something else we have to think about is the ancient concept of public versus private. I'm going to go to the modern concept of public versus private first. In the modern world, we think of certain things that are public. Things that are public would be politics, the judiciary, commerce, production. Those are all considered public. Private would be social influence and things that happened at home. And things that are mixed would be like religion, going to church. That's kind of public, kind of private. We're not really sure how to categorize it. That's the modern world. The ancient world viewed things very differently, especially Greco-Roman. They thought two things were public. That is politics and judiciary, which are the things that the patriarch was the face of the family for. Everything else was considered private. Commerce, production, social influence, home, and religion is all private, except for maybe temple, which might be public as well. So you do see men more in these public spheres, but when it comes back to production, production is considered private because the main economic unit of society is the household, not the external business. The idea that production is public came with the Industrial Revolution that ripped production from the household and home shops and agrarian societies and put it in factories that are separated and distant from the family. So let's look at heterarchy and how it works. To understand heterarchy, we need to think about household maintenance. Household is the main economic unit of society. So when we're talking about household maintenance, this is business and home. Household maintenance is not stay-at-home mom housekeeping. It is business and home united together. You can't separate them. So make sure you're viewing them simultaneously as we talk about this. Both business and home together as one unit. The ancient world did not separate those, so we cannot either in our understanding. Maintenance activities are those tasks upon which the survival of the household depends. You have to do things or your household literally perishes. Most maintenance tasks were divided by gender. Every culture in the world has divided maintenance tasks by gender. Now, every culture will say different things are masculine or feminine. One culture will say fishing is a man's job. The other culture says fishing is a woman's job. One culture says making pottery is the man's job. The other culture says making pottery is the woman's job. The only ones that are consistent throughout all ancient cultures is men protect, women bear children. Those are the only gender roles that I know of from my reading that are consistent throughout all cultures. Everything else changes and vacillates throughout culture. Again, fishing might be masculine to culture A, but feminine to culture B. Basket weaving in culture C is feminine, but it's masculine in culture D. And so these sorts of things, tasks are always split up by gender, but what tasks are assigned to each gender is completely culturally dependent in the ancient world and throughout the world. So let's look at specifically how they divided up tasks in the sustenance agrarian Israelite society. So there was hierarchy in the household, but it was not gender-based hierarchy, it was age-based hierarchy. The patriarch would oversee the men's tasks, which we'll get into for a minute. So the patriarch would oversee all the men in the household doing the men's tasks. The matriarch would oversee all the women in the household doing the women's tasks. So they have hierarchy, but it's age dependent. And the matriarch may end up commanding some of the men or using her power and influence to get the men in the household to do something she needs, and likewise with the patriarch. And there are certain things, all hands on deck, everybody, harvest and planting, all hands on deck, everybody had to work together for that. That was extremely important. But overall, there were differences in what the genders did. So as we've talked about, the patriarch is the face of politics, and some of his sons would be venturing into that a little bit, especially the oldest. He's the face of politics, judicial, family business. The men were often the ones who would work at distance from the dwelling, sometimes or even often alone. They would be out in the field repairing walls, shepherding the sheep, things that were more dangerous because they have to be farther away. And you are dealing with, you could have roving bands of marauders. The Philistines could just come sweeping through. Sometimes women were shepherdess, but sometimes you didn't want them to be shepherdess because you don't know if the Philistines are going to come through and sweep off the women, take them away. You want somebody out there who's a little bit stronger. So the men often worked at distance from the dwelling because they didn't have the reproductive necessity that the women had. They would do things like shepherding, field work, threshing, etc. The men produced the raw materials, grain, wool, flax, maybe clay, that one I'm not sure on, grapes, dates, legumes, etc. So the men produced raw materials that are needed, but in and of themselves, by themselves, do not provide sustenance for the household. The men would train sons. They would take on the protection of the dwellings and the household. They would care for many of the physical dwellings and the structures, especially when Israel needed to have terraced farming. They would spend a lot of effort rebuilding those terraces and maintaining those so that they could farm. And they would officiate the formal religious rituals. The women's tasks were just as needed and necessary. They would create social mutual aid networks. They don't have police, fire, ambulances. Your family 3 houses down has a sickness or is starving. It's the mutual aid networks that the women created who would know and be able to take care of these things. The women would gather information on crime, abuse, etc. They would understand the pulse of the family and community. And this happened because the women worked near the dwelling, usually in a group. So you have the men going out from the dwelling far away, and they are doing lone work or maybe in small groups with their own household for their own land, etc. Far away. Women are doing communal work together, providing food, making physical goods. And so you have women from various households working together, sharing communal ovens, sharing communal looms for weaving, and they would be talking the whole time they're working, grinding grain together, and they would be getting a pulse on the community. And the information that the women gathered in doing this was extremely crucial for the men to be able to do their public face representation. If they didn't have the women gathering intel on what was going on in the community, the patriarch could not be the face of the family doing his judicial duties. The women had incredible power because they were in control of bread. They were the ones who transformed the grain into bread. That means they made the ovens. They knew how to make the ovens. They knew how fine to grind the grain, how to make the stones to grind their grain. The advanced technology needed to make bread, which is the very food of survival, was completely women known. Bread making and weaving and even some of the pottery were some of the most technologically advanced tasks these cultures did, and they were purview of women who held proprietary knowledge over them. The matriarch held power and control in her family over food, lighting. She got to decide when the lamps got lit at night. She needed to make sure there was enough oil to get them through the night. They would burn lamps all night long. That's why Proverbs 31 woman, it says her lamp does not go out at night. That's not because she's staying up super late to work. It's because you burnt a lamp all night, and she needed to know how much oil it was. And so the Proverbs 31 woman is A, wealthy enough to have enough oil to burn it all night, and B, good enough at her job to know how much oil she needs to burn the lamp all night. And that's the matriarch's job. She is in charge of bread. One of my favorite antidotes from my reading is it's an Egyptian tale. So this is also Egyptian. This is just ancient Near East culture. In this tale, a man is mad at his god for a decision the god made. And to show the silliness of the man being mad at him, the god gives this example. A man comes in from the field for lunch. His wife gives him food, but the man wants more. His wife says no. The man goes out mad at his wife for not giving him more food. And the point of the story is a man questioning his God is as ridiculous as the patriarch demanding more food from the matriarch. That is her purview. She has power over the food. That is her job. And when she says 3 loaves of bread is what we have for lunch, the man's job is to say, yes, ma'am, thank you for my bread. I'm going to go back to work now, and not fight her on it. And this is an ancient Egyptian tale that everyone's like, yeah, of course. We don't argue with the matriarch about how much food we get. We know this. And so arguing with our gods is just as bad as arguing with the matriarch over how much food we get. So the matriarch has control over food, light, medicine. She not only would be in charge of bread, but also beer, liquid. Both beer is made from wheat, from grains. So that's liquid calories, liquid energy. Today we're consumed with losing weight. Back then they're like, how can we keep it on? What are the most calorie dense foods we can have? Clothing. I think it would take like 100 hours to weave one person's tunic. Women were in charge of care of infants, care of the sick. They need medicine. And then there's all the religious rituals that go along with these maintenance tasks with the bread. A lot of the Mosaic law, if a mouse dies in your flour, you have to throw out all the flour. Well, who's monitoring that? It's the women. The women are in charge of the household religious maintenance activities. One thing we also don't realize is that women in the ancient world could have professions. They would have guilds, which is again organized by age. And these guilds in the Old Testament could be midwifery, healers, mourning, professional mourners who you would hire to come mourn someone who had died. They also could be businesswomen, traders in the market. When you got more urban areas, especially with kings, they would conscript women to be cookers and bakers and perfumers, medicinal people in their palace complexes. There were women who had significant roles in the tent of meeting in the temple as well. They worked at the doorways. They were prophets. Sometimes women even partook in sorcery, which was condemned by the Bible, but women had hands in all sorts of these sorts of things. When we get to the New Testament, I'm just going to read off to you a list of professions that Roman women had outside their household. They could be stenographers, nannies, wet nurses, household managements of other people's houses, as well as their own. Household management included inspecting produce and all the goods brought in, storage of food, organization, caring for the sick, supervising slaves, male and female, making sure the houses and barns are clean, instructing the household on how to work and what to do, weaving, spinning. Outside the house, they could be tutors, teachers. These are wage earning kinds of jobs. They could buy and sell. They could be farmers. They could be brick makers and or owners of brick making businesses, landlords, renting, buying, selling property, owning restaurants, making clothing production, lending, borrowing, patronage, clerks, personal servants like hairdressers, wardrobe keepers, errand girls, entertainers, medicine, doctors, midwives, etc. So women had a lot of various roles they could have. So just to go back and take a high level view, the cultures of the Bible are a patricentric heterarchy. Patricentrism is how you structure the family with the patriarch as the representational face of the family. Heterarchy is the power structures organized around the tasks that need to be done and who has control of what part of the family. The matriarch may tell all of the men what to do because families 3 houses down from my social aid network I've created, they need bread. So you're going to take this bread that me and the women have made and you're going to take it down to them, or you're going to take it to the next village over. Women, because it was patrilocal, the women would move from village A to village B to live with their husband. But at large community gatherings, they would meet up with the women from their home village and their family members, and they would keep the ties there. So women were crucial in maintaining inter-clan relationships and even intertribal relationships, as well as village relationships and household relationships. In the ancient world, women had exceptional power and necessity in the Old Testament. This is why the Proverbs 1 woman is held up as such a strong, vibrant woman, because it's not a top-down gender hierarchy like Grudem, Piper, Gothard, and DeYoung describe. It's this flourishing community where people have various roles and they lead and they follow in different areas according to what needs to be done for the good of the family as a whole. Everybody's working together for the common goal of family unity and survival. And so sometimes the men would follow the lead of the women, sometimes the women would follow the lead of the men, but leadership is shared according to the task that is needed. It was not based purely on gender. Yes, the patriarch had more power and more responsibility than any other member of the household. He was primarily responsible for protection, but women's roles cannot be degraded to merely being assistants to the men. In the ancient world, women were far more than assistants. And they had incredible power and necessity in their households for what they would do and how they would help. I cannot wait to discuss this with you further, and I hope this is helpful.